There is a certain effervescent problem beginning to come to the surface of the internet. A problem that has been brewing for quite some time now, namely how to govern the internet, how to regulate it and control it. For a very long time now, various national or supernatural entities, or before that even companies, have attempted to enforce their own rules and standards on the internet. In many ways, this began with the ever-increasing breadth and scope of terms of service for online games, attempting to carve out specific rules of behavior that everyone was expected to follow, which of course then also affected what you were allowed to say, to whom, and so on. But now, the big guys have started entering the field, with things like the European Union, for example, having created its own set of legislation that it's attempting to enforce on everybody. We even also have, of course, nations' legislatures, with one of the most famous examples being a certain Brazilian judge who is using the Brazilian law system to, well, attack those he doesn't like, basically, as he's made it his mission to crack down on the right wing on the internet. How? Well, by cracking down on social media platforms, and also certain other things like Rumble, for example. And I want to point out as well, this move towards censorship and control, the only reason why we're even seeing it right now is because the preceding play for power actually did fail. There was a very long time there, a good decade plus, where all of the various social media giants were all in lockstep with one another. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, everything was pretty much the same entity as far as values and terms of service were concerned. And the handful of breakouts like Rumble or Kick or what even was that? BitChute, there we go. These things were alternatives, but they never actually tried to be competitors, and so control of the internet was already secured until, well, Musk bought Twitter, of course, which is one of the reasons why we're now seeing ever more legislation be placed upon social media platforms, as the previous soft power takeover failed. This is beginning to escalate ever more quickly now as well, with attempts to begin to crush the alternatives, as some of them have begun to take off as well. Rumble always kind of plateaued in my opinion, but Kick is doing remarkably well, and we also now have some actual allies too, with the White House having warned Britain, for example, that it shouldn't try to enforce British regulations and rules upon American companies and American customers. The British response to this has simply been to announce that they will yet further strengthen and make more severe their Online Safety Act, as all of the various parties are now squaring up against one another, using the threats of fines or blocking certain platforms in their countries as a leverage. And this is the interesting thing as well, because as I've talked about before, the internet used to be very, very, very free, to the point where it was practically unregulated, even in a legalistic sense. There were a lot of spicy stuff bubbling about just the common everyday internet merely just 10, 15 years ago. And a large part of the reason why we don't have that anymore, well, it's because of a slow push towards more safety, which is always the key word whenever some supernatural governmental entity like the EU begins to try to regulate stuff, or Britain, the Online Safety Act, etc. And there was an article that came out, I think just the other day, I know, which really kind of puts all of this into stark relief and contrast, as this entire article is about those parts of the fandoms, the ones that really didn't actually belong in any fandom, but rather latched onto it like parasites, dragging in external nonsense and talking more about their porn fantasies rather than the actual fandom itself. And hey, listen, I am no prude. You want to make fanfic about a couple of characters in Supernatural having vicious, wallpaper-peeling gay sex with one another? Go right ahead. I don't really mind. I'm not frequenting those forums all that often, but the problem then quickly became that these people believed themselves to be somehow in deserving positions of special protections. When people came by their blog and went, "Oh my god, that is vile," they would report it to moderators, they would scream about it. Sexism this, homophobia that, racism this. In this article, we have examples of transgender, biracial black man, apparently, who was harassed for his fanfiction. Biracial black man. Does that mean he's a white guy who's black now? Or that he was a black man who's now white? Never mind. We're not even... That way lies madness. But this is where a lot of this began, with screams of, oh, we need protection, we need safe spaces, we need regulation, hey, social media, I'm being attacked, help me, and an ever-increasing push towards, well, not even responsibility, but consequences for online actions. Yes, that's the correct way of putting it. Where we saw things like during the early days of Gamergate, where certain female persona screamed, I am being harassed, I've had to flee my home, etc. But I'm not really going to talk to the police. I don't see the point in that. However, I am going to report all of the people who allegedly did this to me to the social media platforms. And I'm going to call for governments to start regulating these platforms to provide me with my safe place. And obviously, many various governments and the EU leapt upon this. What? An opportunity to expand our influence onto the internet, which used to be basically by definition neutral ground, because nobody owns the internet. Nobody controls the internet. It was genuinely so a land without borders. And then the left arrived and quickly began painting up those borders. It is truly remarkable how progressivism always seems to somehow achieve the exact opposite of what it espouses to want. And now, we find ourselves in the fascinating position where hordes of horny, sexually repressed lesbians, having bothered everyone with their horrific gay fanfiction for a decade, has arrived at the position where America is yelling at Great Britain over stop censoring the internet. It seems it's a bit of a strange, sequence of consequence and actions and reactions here, but that's basically what has happened now. As well, what we're going to see is, of course, the various countries going, well, we have rules. Our rules say A, B, C, D, E, D, etc., blah, 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 but those rules are probably not going to be compatible with another nation's rules. Free speech rules in England, non-existent, versus America, for example. And therefore, if an English court goes, hey, Facebook, you've got to take this down, then obviously Facebook's nation of hosting can go, hold on there, you can't enforce your rules upon our citizens, and so on. And in the case of America, we're just lucky that there's the Trump-a-luffagus in office at the moment, who's the only one even attempting to push back on this stuff. And here's the thing too. I do indeed believe that there does need to be a degree of accountability for the platforms as well, to the rules and regulations of the hosting nations. When, for example, social media used to habitually violate free speech back in the day, or crush political opposition, yes, there's absolutely a need then for the courts to enforce the public square. However, then we arrive, of course, on the topic of censorship, and how more often than not, whoever holds the power at that point in time will swiftly move to censor their opposition, as this is not an exclusively left-wing phenomenon. They were merely the ones who pushed it the first and the hardest online. What is going to happen is probably various nations dick measuring with one another until one or two begin backing down, and one or two's legal framework is enforced on the rest via some form of treaty. What should happen is for that treaty to be something actually neutral. It probably isn't, but that would be the ideal outcome. In essence, Bill of Rights for the Internet in total, agreed upon by a coalition of nations. Not the EU by itself, but rather the majority of Western powers preferably. And it should, and again this is definitely not going to happen, be based on the idea of the Internet as a neutral space, where primary values such as freedom of expression is protected over the modern day Western world's rights against being offended. See, ideally speaking as well, the idea of a safe space is actually entirely fine on the internet. If you want a safe space where you can share all of the homosexual supernatural fanfiction, as in the TV show, that your heart desires, okay, well, we should be able to create a group for that, like the Facebook groups, for example. You want to talk about that stuff? No skin off my back, feel free to do so, but do not then demand that everybody else cater to you. That was the problem, where one group's set of rights to be weird in private was no longer enough, and they demanded to be allowed to be weird everywhere else, indeed culminating in months-long parades and celebrations of their weirdness marching through the streets of the world's capitals. That didn't work out either, but we do need a unified framework for the internet. It is the only way to avoid essentially an endless period of legislative warfare between various power blocks over whose rules actually apply on the internet. Either that or each nation simply begins to prosecute its own citizens for arbitrary violations, which is what they would then in essence become on the internet, as you're basically going to have to consider your internet activities as a part of Britain or a part of America or France, etc., rather than actually actions on the internet. Which is going to lead to a host of other complications as well, especially privacy concerns, for example. And I guarantee you, VPNs have got like 5-10 years of life left in them until they're probably going to be banned in the majority of the world. I don't like it, but it's going to happen. Now, whether or not this kind of wide-reaching censorship is even possible depends. See, one of the reasons why this has taken so long to bubble up to the surface is because the various powers that be didn't really understand how the internet worked, or how they could, influence it effectively. They still really don't, and they still have all kinds of weird suppositions about how a court in Britain can enforce its will and lay fines upon a company in America. Indeed, that was part of the reason why the whole Brazil and Elon Musk thing happened, where Brazil was threatening to seize X's infrastructure in Brazil. X didn't really have any, and so what are you going to do? It's an empty threat. They could theoretically fine Twitter $1 million a day for all eternity, but so long as Twitter doesn't actually have any money in Brazil, what are they going to do about it? Nothing, of course. But they haven't been able to get this, and they will begin to understand that the way to enforce their power is either by attempting to deny access, which isn't going to work out in the long term, mind you. The EU has already threatened to cut off access to the EU, 4, 5, 6 times at this point? And they've managed to push through some basic stuff. You know, with that pop-up that occasionally comes up going like, we need permission to gather your data, blah, 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 EU regulations. That's that. But everyone just simply clicks agree to all or disagree to all, and that's it. It has no real actual effect. Which is why we will eventually see some form of an international treaty, which will bind the various companies wherever they are located, but Even that could very well simply just be moving the problem a few steps further down the road, as Meta or Twitter or whatever, various online providers simply go, okay, well, doing business in country A is no longer possible. However, we've got like 300 million customers in country A, so we're just going to move our entire infrastructure over to country B, which is not a signature of this treaty, and keep going as per usual. The ideal solution, of course, would simply have been to maintain neutrality, but we were denied that preferential option, so now I just can't have to deal with the fact that censorship and regulations on the internet are going to just get worse for a good decade plus or so, whilst all the powers that be quibble over who gets to slap the internet's users around the most with their legislative dicks. But again, on the bright side, at least there is a champion of the internet's freedom, and the Trumfaluffagus is hardly perfect on this matter either, but he's sure as hell a fuckload better than Keir Starmer or the European Union. You imagine the UK in charge of the internet. Happy little nightmare. But yeah. This is going to continue for quite some time. We are going to see more and more of it, and it is going to be very important that more and more people be aware of this in their voting patterns as well in the various countries across the world. I would highly recommend that you don't try to give too much political power to those who are in the interest groups eager to censor the internet, because as we saw with just yesterday's video, if it weren't for the internet, if it weren't for dissident media, and Twitter, for its many flaws, has in essence become just that, there's a lot of very important stuff nobody would ever know about. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.